Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here at the Halifax International Security Forum in Nova Scotia, Canada, one of the world's leading gatherings of military, security, economic, political, and cultural thought leaders from around the world. And we have one of those thought leaders with us right now from Washington, Dr. Alina Polyakova, who is with the Brookings Institution. You are a very seasoned expert in looking at Russia, and you have a new report out, which is Russia's Trojan Horses, which looks at Russian efforts in Southern Europe to try to undermine societal cohesion. Has it been a good conference for you so far?
Yeah, so thanks for having me. Halifax has been incredible. It's really an amazing convening platform for all the allies, basically, from the transatlantic community, and also some of our friends and colleagues from the Russian opposition. So it's been a good place to connect with them and understand where they're coming from and how they're looking at Russia for the presidential elections in March and also going forward in the 5 to 6 year term.
It looks like, funny enough, that Vladimir Putin looks like he might be staying in power a little bit longer. To fight any adversary, you have to really understand what he's trying to do aside from just sow discord and chaos. And that he's sort of been successful on. What's Putin's ultimate game as somebody who spends a lot of time doing it? Is it, the purely opportunistic bottom feeder, as some see it? Others see it as a kind of a guy who is playing chess with a world that's more used to playing checkers. How do you see it, and what is, the right way to look at Russia to try to counter what it's doing all the time, everywhere?
Look, I think you point to the fact that there's been this broad debate happening among the Russia watchers, whether Putin is a tactician or a strategist. I don't think those are mutually exclusive. I don't think that's the right way to think about it. I mean, clearly tactics can feed into a broader strategy, and that's actually what we've seen Putin develop since the year 2000 when he first came into office. He is very good at identifying vacuums of absence of Western leadership. He's very willing to take on more risks and test Western resolve vis-a-vis Russia, and he has obviously done this in Ukraine, he's done this in Syria, and he's actually doing this in North Korea as well, where on the one hand, the Kremlin is playing the game of being on China's side to trying to better that relationship in the diplomatic environment and the UN Security Council, for example. But on the other hand, is also covertly supplying the North Koreans with supplies, training, technical assistance, et cetera, to make this really a pain for the United States. And that's succeeding. I mean, if we just look at this specific example, all of the U.S. focus right now is on North Korea. So what does that mean? The U.S. is not really looking and not really concerned with other areas that are of deep concern and interest to Russia and to Putin specifically, like Central Asia, other parts of the post-Soviet space. And I think that we're going to continue to see this kind of playing around with what the boundaries are until there are real concrete consequences of Putin's actions. I think the big end game is already what Putin has been putting in place. If we look at frozen conflict zones, right, just look at a map, it looks like a buffer line between EU, NATO, and Russia. And it's really this reinstatement of kind of territorial influence that Putin sees as the key to establishing Russia as a great power on the world stage again.
And that's his near abroad strategy, right, which is anything that's on our borders should be safeguarded. Do you think that the steps that the alliance has taken, or the United States or each one of the NATO members, is actually going to deter him from action? Because there's still a debate whether or not he will actually take territorial action against NATO in a way that undermines the cohesion of the alliance, which is the goal. It's not necessarily the territory, it's the action that exposes the organization as a fraud. Are you convinced that everything that the alliance has done, we heard from Jens Stoltenberg, Peter Pavel, the chairman of the NATO Military Committee, was here as well, saying a lot of the right things as they would as alliance leaders. Are you convinced that he won't, that those efforts have been sufficient to deter him?
Look, I don't think the Russians or the Kremlin is stupid enough to launch a conventional military attack against a NATO member state. That doesn't mean that the Baltic states should not be concerned about Russian incursion, however. What we've seen the Kremlin do is they look at war as a spectrum, and I think one of the allied leaders actually said this, that from their perspective, from our opponent's perspective, it doesn't matter if we're saying we're in a Cold War or hot war. The reality is that Russia, as the opponent of the West, sees itself at war somewhere in the low spectrum of warfare. So you want to call it a hybrid war or whatever else, That's really where they are right now. I think the more likely scenario, a potential scenario, is that we'll continue to see Russian military testing in the Baltic Sea, trying to see if there's going to be a response. Elsewhere, maybe in the Black Sea as well, where they now have control over Crimea. And they're going to potentially start playing around a little bit with hybrid war. So what would happen if suddenly, maybe not in Estonia, but what if little green men appeared in either a Baltic state or Montenegro, which is a NATO member now, I think is very vulnerable. The Russians basically tried to stage a coup there recently. What happens? So something so small doesn't trigger Article 5, but is clearly some sort of deniable plausibility incursion from the Russians. What happens then? So I think the NATO activities and also U.S. commitment to NATO has been very clear, shoring up the eastern flank, reinvesting in our capabilities, reorienting them again towards Russia as opposed to non-state actors or terrorist groups. These are all really good things that we need to keep doing to raise the cost. But I think at the end of the day, if the Russians want to do something, it's not going to be a clear Article 5 moment.
At least the Estonian defense chief, Rio Teros, underscored that if little green men show up in Estonia, they're shooting to kill.
That's right.
He was pretty clear about that when we spoke to him.
All right, well, the Estonians might shoot them, but then will the Italians come to the rescue? Will the Germans come to the rescue if need be? I'm not sure.
And that's the big debate, right? I mean, we talked to the Italian air chief in Dubai when we were there last week, and his view was, as you would expect, somebody farther away from it. He said, look, deterrence is still very important, but for him, dialogue was also equally important, and he stressed that with both Russia and China. Let me take you to the issue of the disinformation campaigns. We just got back from Norway. Disinformation is happening even in northern Norway, where the Russian consul general is actually involved in some of those disinformation campaigns, as we've seen elsewhere. They have paid dividends, but was it a strategic mistake for the Russians to do that, given now everybody is energized? We heard Eric Schmidt, the Alphabet chairman, talk about the importance that his organization and other tech firms can play in controlling this sort of behavior. Talk to us about whether or not, that was just temporary gains as opposed to strategic gains now that everybody is heightened in their awareness of what the challenge and the problem is.
Well, I don't think there's been a loss for the Kremlin yet. Frankly, it takes a lot of political will, and so far we haven't seen a coordinated transatlantic response to the question of propaganda warfare, information warfare against Western democracies. So despite Russian intervention and meddling in the U.S. elections, despite their intervention in the various referendum, the Brexit, Catalonia, German elections, they try to meddle in the French elections. Despite all of that,
U.S. elections?
Yes, that was the first thing I said.
Oh, sorry about that.
So despite all of these activities, there hasn't been a coordinated response from EU and the U.S. together to say, these are the steps we're going to take to put an end to this information warfare, and to really start to hit back, particularly in the cyberspace as well, because, of course, information and cyber attacks are all linked from the Russian point of view. We saw this very clearly in the United States, and it's being repeated elsewhere as well. So I think that's the next step. And, frankly, when you have a president in the United States who doesn't like to acknowledge that there was any Russian meddling, President Trump just said this recently, that he believes Mr. Putin versus the U.S. intelligence community. I'm not sure how you get that transatlantic consensus when the U.S. is not coming to the table. And I think here in Halifax, that's actually been one of the big questions that everybody has been discussing. Where is the U.S. on these issues? And I can't say that there's a clear message yet. And I think that's actually the next step. After that, there's a lot of things that we can do. Certainly, the West is much more savvy and sophisticated when it comes to cyber and other tools of tech tools. This is what Eric Schmidt actually said on the panel yesterday. But the Russians are much better and more sophisticated when it comes to human activity. So intelligence gathering, intelligence operations, investing in actual individuals to be part of these troll factories. That's not something the United States or the West has been doing, but we still have the upper hand. For how much longer? That is unclear to me. Maybe 5 years until the Russians and the Chinese develop their capacities and capabilities on the tech side and outpace us. So I think now is the moment to act. And if we don't, then I think 5 years on, Mr. Putin will probably still be in power, and now he'll have the entire sort of tech capabilities and capacities and the technologies that we have in the United States. And where do we go from there? So I think now is a really critical moment, and I hope that the allies will recognize that.
Very few people have studied the issue more than you have, both in the current report, but also the one that you did hiding in plain sight when you were at the Atlantic Council. What are some of the specific actions that the United States, the alliance, and allied and associated nations, right? I mean, you can include Finland in that and Sweden in that, have to take, because every single one of these countries has faced the pain associated with some of these specific actions that blur the lines between, propaganda, intelligence, counterintelligence operations. What are some of the specific steps that have to be accepted on an alliance-wide basis?
I think step number one is recognizing that there are many stakeholders in this. So unlike in Russia or China, which are authoritarian regimes, the response from the West, I think, has to involve civil society, media, the tech sector, the private firms, et cetera. It cannot be just a government or NATO-style approach. So from that perspective, step number one is for the allied member states, including NATO itself, to allocate more resources to civil society organizations that are doing investigative research. So everything we've seen from the Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers, this has been the work of investigative journalists. That work is very difficult to do. It costs a lot of money. We need more resources. And governments can do a lot to allocate resources to independent organizations to do this kind of work for them, right? Because in the information war, we all have doubts about, if the message comes from the U.S. government or the EU or NATO official source, people question that because we've seen this decline in the trust in these institutions across the West. So the messenger really, really matters, and that messenger has to be an independent voice. So I think that's step number one, is recognizing that. I think step number two is building a closer coordination, set of coordination relationships between the EU, NATO, and the United States. Oddly enough, even EU and NATO don't coordinate, as far as I can tell, that closely on these non-conventional military issues, right? At the national level, many governments in Europe have set up what they call these hybrid threat teams or STRATCOM teams to try to monitor and track and inform disinformation activities. But again, there's not a platform for the governmental level, at the NATO level, at the EU level, for all of these different activities to coordinate with each other. So we need to set up some sort of coordinating function at that level for sharing ideas, sharing information. So that's step number two. And I think thirdly, and this is something that has to happen, I think, in the classified community, we already have great intelligence sharing within the allied members, but I also think that that is where the offensive has to come from. So we've been talking about what can we do to react, right? What can we do to shore up our defenses? But I think to get ahead of the Russian agenda, get ahead of these narratives, I think clouding people's minds, hacking brains, right? We have to get on the offensive. I think that has to come from the unseen classified realm, frankly. I think there's a lot more we can do to bring some pain to the Russians in terms of using the similar tools they've used against us in the cyber domain. And, at this point, the Russians think they're at war with us. We are not comfortable saying we're at war with them, but maybe this is where the mental switch has to go.
And very last question. We talked to Mikhail Kasyanov, former prime minister, leader of the People's Freedom Party in Russia, and his sense that Putin's time is numbered, that he's not as popular at home as the West thinks. A lot of those polls that the West is fed are actually done by Putin and Putin's team, which is why you get sort of Stalinist highs in terms of popularity. But what are the chances? I mean, as somebody who watches Russia very closely, how secure is Putin? How strong is the opposition ultimately? And is there going to be any political change whatsoever? I mean, even when we're discussing whether there's going to be any succession at all, given Putin is assured for another 6-year term, so that's not going to change. Talk to us about sort of the Russian perspective, his popularity at home, and how the opposition is going to do this. Mikhail called on Western governments to keep putting pressure on the government overall. It's able to take a lot of pressure ultimately. So talk to us about what you think about all that.
Well, I think you're right. People have been asking themselves for a long time these incredible popularity rankings that Putin seems to care deeply about, 80 to 90% popularity in the polls. Are they real? Or are they not real? Of course, Russia is a country where the state has complete control of the media apparatus. The majority of Russians get their information from state-sponsored media. So we have to take what people think about the regime with that understanding. They're not getting information about who Putin is, what he does, etc. It's not clear to them. Obviously, partially because of U.S. sanctions, primarily because of the fluctuations in oil prices, the Russian people outside of major cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg have taken a pretty major hit when it comes to standard of living over the last 2 years, and they're starting to feel the pain. So you would think that your life chances, your opportunities are declining, your kids' opportunities are declining, that you would want some change in government. However, most of what we're seeing in the popularity rankings is that while Putin is very popular, United Russia Party, his party, is not very popular. And what we're seeing the Kremlin do is they understand this, and Putin is now saying that he will run likely as an independent. So he's trying to distance himself from this very unpopular United Russia Party and almost run as an anti-establishment candidate, as bizarre as that sounds, against his own party, because he understands that people see him as this kind of benevolent czar, and then they see everyone else, local officials, mayors, governors, the United Russia Party that's headed by Medvedev, the most unpopular politician in Russia today, as corrupt, and they're really blaming them for their problems and not Putin. And he's playing with this kind of dissonance that the Russians seem to have as they're thinking about who will improve our lives and who's to blame for the conditions that we find ourselves in. The Russian opposition is relatively weak. Alexei Navalny, I think, is the individual that most of us hear about in the West. He's the one that certainly received more recognition across Russia outside the major cities. There were some protests this spring that he called for. He's become very popular on YouTube. What does the Kremlin do? They try to censor YouTube, try to ban it so that young people don't have access to it. There were a lot of young people that came to the streets in those protests. So you see that even with somebody like Navalny, who would probably, even if he was able to run in the March presidential elections, would not be a real threat to Putin. He doesn't have the control of the media. Again, take this with a grain of salt. It's Russian polling. But he was shown to receive maybe maximum 3% of the vote in the elections. You can say, okay, maybe it'll be 10%, but still, that's not a real threat to the regime. So when you're thinking about how stable is Putin, how in control is he really? So you have this situation that I just described, but on the other hand, you see the Kremlin, at the behest of Putin, almost acting in a very paranoid way. So even somebody who's not a real threat, like Alexei Navalny, they are trying to keep him from running. They're trumping up all these political charges, forcing him to go in the courts to prevent him from actually running in the presidency. So that shows how actually deeply vulnerable and fragile the regime seems to be, because if you're confident about your power, why suppress these very relatively small opposition leaders? When you have complete control of the media, complete control of the economy, what are you so afraid of? And I think that's the big question. If there was some opening in Russia, Putin would likely still stay in power, right? But I think the way that the regime is trying to suppress independent voices really signals that they see some fissures, they see some potential fractions, and then they're becoming increasingly more paranoid.
Doesn't that actually make the government more dangerous, in a sense? Doesn't that make Putin more dangerous if there is that inherent fragility and actually fuel potential likelihood for adventurism?
Well, I think certainly it makes Putin and the regime more dangerous to the Russian people. We've clearly seen this, over the last few years. There's been brazen attacks, murders of opposition leaders, of course, most famously Boris Nemtsov, many other journalists. And now we're seeing the regime is pursuing them not just in Russia, but in Western countries where these people thought they were safe. They're not safe anymore. So being an opposition leader, I really commend Mikhail Kasyanov, who you mentioned, and others, for staying in Russia, because this is a dangerous game for them now. And you see the regime really pushing to get rid of any voices of opposition. Now, on the foreign policy side, how does that affect their foreign policy? I think first and foremost, Russian foreign policy is driven by domestic concerns. So, and it's driven primarily, many times, by Putin's own understanding how popular he is. So Crimea, of course, a huge boon to his popularity. He was, kind of lingering in the high 60s, low 70s, which is great approval ratings for any Western leader, but for him, that was actually quite low. And so after Crimea, there's about a 10-point boost to his popularity ratings, and they've stayed pretty stable. I don't think it's a coincidence that the presidential elections were scheduled on the day of Crimean referendum annexation, the exact day. They're trying to use this very popular foreign policy move to shore up nationalist support for Putin. Syria didn't get much of a bump, right? And now I think they're trying to figure out, what will continue to shore up the nationalist sentiment in Russia. And, I could see a situation where after the elections, the Kremlin moves to do something else, depending on how the elections go, depending on how his popularity goes up or goes down. So I think Russia becomes indeed this very volatile actor in the world stage because of the considerations on the domestic front.
Dr. Alina Polyakova of the Brookings Institution, thank you very much for talking to us.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you.